cases. But from when the soldiers were initially deployed to actually seeing some calm being restored, it took quite some time. So I don't think that we would be, our fears as a country would be allayed completely, because we saw that government is very slow on its responsiveness. From a preemptive and protection point of view, it's slow. The communication is very slow to trigger the responsiveness of the entire system. I mean, you'd see, for example, cities track the responsiveness of emergency systems within periods of, say, up to 15 minutes. But we didn't see that the security cluster is responding, and it would be interesting what barometer they are using compared to, for example, what cities use in relation to what triggers a disaster and what happens after that. So there's an entire leadership vacuum in that entire prevention, responsiveness, and responding in a way that is quick to diffuse whatever risks we face.
David, let me hear from you, given the fact that there was admission from the president that we weren't ready, that we didn't have resources that were commensurate with the threat that we were facing, and we're hardly going to hear from government or the security forces what the plan is ahead. So in the scenario planning going forward, David, what would be dependent on us achieving, security and stability?
Hi, good evening, Chidiso. I think, there are two things we need to consider first when we are trying to understand the lack of effective response. I think you just played a clip of the minister saying that we meaning they, could have done much better. The one thing obviously is that we are dealing with a phenomenon that is completely novel. It's not service delivery protest. The president characterized it last night as an anti-constitutional sort of insurrection, something that we've not experienced. And the security services have not been orientated towards this kind of thing. The other problem is that we have, obviously, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the degrading of the security and intelligence institutions. And the minister has started a process of reconstituting and restructuring these services. But it's not, it is slow and steady work. And obviously, crises do not wait for you to complete your work in transforming and professionalizing and capacitating. And it found the security and intelligence community wanting at the time when it is just starting to re-emerge from a decade of neglect. I would imagine that, in the coming weeks, having had the exposure now to the crisis, having, in a sense, characterized it for what it is, that the response should be more efficient from now onwards. I mean, I think if we continue to see the kind of response or lack thereof we've seen over the last 2 weeks, that would be an indictment, on the entire system of governance, really, not just the security cluster. But one would hope that, they would be doing the scenarios to see how could this situation unfold, what are the kinds of interventions that might be useful in mitigating, in disrupting, and what are the capabilities really that must be urgently developed and deployed to improve the responsiveness of the system.
Okay, Dr. Guy Lamb, I'm coming to you next, but before I ask you the question, I'd like us to just take a look back at the confidence shown by the president saying that the perpetrators will be apprehended. Let's take a quick listen and watch this excerpt quickly from.
We will find those who have instigated this violence. They will be held accountable for their deeds. Because we will not allow anyone in our country to destabilize the country and to get away with it. And we will not allow any person or any group, whoever they are, to challenge the authority of our democratically elected government. Because this is in the end a challenge to the people of South Africa.
All right, guys, so what are your thoughts on what would be a deterrent? Because we're seeing some reports saying this is phase one. There's some political parties who have even suggested that those who've been arrested ought to be charged with treason or sedition. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think kind of maybe just to come in here, I just want to sort of make a contribution on the previous question about the intelligence services and the security services, and about, reforms are happening within the intelligence services and they've been relatively slow. But I think we're at a key moment here, and I want to sort of take us to what happened in the US following the 9/11 attacks, which was this unexpected terrorist attack. And they set up a Congressional Commission of Inquiry into the intelligence services, because the reason I say this is because the Minister of State Security made some very interesting comments earlier in the week. She said that intelligence had been provided, and that intelligence had been given to the necessary authorities, including the police, but they hadn't necessarily acted on it. So there's some interesting things that are coming out of here. Number one, quality of the intelligence. Was the intelligence useful, actionable? And number two is, if the intelligence was provided, why wasn't it used? So, and the problem in the intelligence services, often it's the lack of coordination or institutional competition or personality clashes. So I think those are some key issues that really need to be taken into account. And I think we're at the sort of moment where if we want government to take us back into their confidence, they can say, we're fixing things, we're sorry. I think we really need to get to the bottom of what's going on in the intelligence services, because we had the high-level panel that was chaired by Sidney Mufamadi, and it made some very, very worrying and concerning findings. And that was only about 2 years ago. So we really need to know what has changed, but also how do we prevent this thing from happening going forward? And how do we ensure that we get quality intelligence and that intelligence is acted upon? Then going to your question about, the necessary kind of criminal justice response to these perpetrators. So number one, we obviously need good intelligence. We need good evidence. So you can have the necessary charges pursued against the so-called ringleaders and instigators, but you need the evidence to prove it. So you'll need to have, the social media messages that they may have sent out. You would have needed, any WhatsApp messages, any voice notes, any recordings, any records. And I think this is going to be quite tricky to secure, because we've got some good evidence, individuals incited it, but if we don't have strong enough evidence, we won't be able to pursue strong charges such as treason or sedition or insurrection. We do really need strong evidence for that. And of course, you've got opposition political parties calling for this, because it's about more generating popular support for their particular views, where I think in terms of trying to secure this is going to be really very difficult. Because if you look at what's happening around the Capitol riots in the US last year, where certainly the FBI and other law enforcement agencies were able to acquire quite a bit of evidence against certain individuals, and hence they were able to move forward with trials. And here the question is, it's very much around the quality of the evidence that will determine whether convictions are secured.
Okay, so Ongama, just staying with this train of thought, I'm wondering then, how will the criminal justice system differentiate those who actually had political motive and those who are taking part in food riots? In other words, is it possible to measure where the one begins and where the other ends? So the acting Secretary General of the ANC spoke about what we're seeing in terms of delegitimizing ANC leadership, but the president himself also saying that it's an attack against a democratic state. And of course, the conflation has often been the problem. Ongama, are you still with us?
He's muted.
I think you're muted,
Hi,
Ongama.
sorry.
Okay, there you go.
Yes, two things here. There are the practicalities of solving cases on a micro level. And then there's the broader political environment and how it has an overbearing on what kind of bureaucratic institutions emerge. So in the first one, I liked what Begicele said in his meetings with communities, that notwithstanding the anger, notwithstanding the broad story that has happened in regions, there are specific acts of criminality committed by specific people So the way forward, for example, that he has provided on responding to the very difficult issues around human dignity, around the criminality and investigation thereof, kind of restored my confidence in that process, in the sense that he was saying to the communities, we're going to come and we're going to find those that committed acts of intimidation and very specific acts of murder. And the communities were very clear too to identify the full scope of what actions can be taken on what. So, for example, they leave there knowing that people must be assisted in finding the bodies of their loved ones who were killed, among other things. So there are very specific things in my response episode that can be done, which are which are legislated, and so within the broader story of many people that were arrested, those acts of criminalities are low-hanging fruits, especially in relation to murder, among other things, because there were videos that were circulating, and as well as acts of intimidation, people barring people's freedom of movement. And then when it comes to the instigator allegations, that's going to need, I think I'm covered with what Dr. Lamb said. But another issue we must talk about in South Africa is the incapability which emerges on the part of the bureaucracy, precisely because the political environment does not reward merit, precisely because the political environment, even at the level of executive political leadership of departments, is premised more on loyalties to particular power networks in the ANC than it does to ensuring that each department has got capable leaders that can lead it from the political executive all the way to director level and officials.
David, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but Guy, I just want to follow up now on what Ongama has just said and then come back to you and say there are those, as I mentioned when I was asking that question, who suggest that there may be a phase two. I want to look at the sophistry of this machinery. We know that social media has been used in connecting networks for particular goals. Some of them are obscure, but some of them are rather patent in their objectives. We've been told that the ANC governing party, we've been told that the presidency, we've been told that other state organs have been given the intelligence that there's a phase two. So I'm trying to figure out how would that then play out? If we're told that people have been found with ammunition, guns that are concerning, talk to me about the sophistry of the machinery that could launch a phase two if there were.
Certainly, it ultimately comes down to what degree the government authorities, particularly the police, have been able to identify, apprehend, and monitor those individuals who are behind this. Because with any sort of violence like this, there is quite a kind of a tight-knit group, tight-knit network of individuals who are involved. So if they're under surveillance or they have been apprehended, then we would likely not see a phase two, or phase two might take place in a small number of areas, and then the violence and the unrest might be very concentrated in a small number of areas. So it's unclear if the actual capacity is there at the moment, because just looking at what's happened in the past few days, there seems to be maybe a few more networks that might still be able to be activated, but it doesn't look like they've got much of a capacity left, just given we're seeing sort of responses from the rest of South Africa on this. But certainly if we look at previously at other forms of conflict, there can be a resort to kind of guerrilla-style tactics, to sabotage type tactics, as we saw certainly under apartheid when, the MK was pushed back by the apartheid security forces. They resorted to sabotage and guerrilla warfare type tactics. So that's potentially could happen. I mean, we've seen some obviously concerns with this 1.5 million rounds of ammunition disappearing in Durban, and where that has gone is a big question, and that that is handgun ammunition by the most recent reports, and most illegal guns in circulation are handguns. So that's obviously a huge concern. So I think it's not clear at the moment. Obviously, we hope the intelligence services and crime intelligence are thinking about this very carefully and looking at it very carefully. But at the moment, it seems as though some of the key ringleaders have been identified, apprehended, and under surveillance. So hopefully this phase 2 will not come to fruition.
So, David, I want us to reflect back on what the president was saying, that this was an attack on the economy. And I want to talk to you about the levers of power if this is indeed an attack on the economy and how it will play out. So let's just listen in on what the president said then.
The ensuing chaos is used as a smokescreen to carry out economic sabotage through targeted attacks on trucks, on factories, on warehouses, and other infrastructure necessary for the functioning of our economy and the provision of services to our people.
So, David, we know that provincial departments of social development and SASSA will use their remaining budgets in the social relief of distress program to provide support in the form of food parcels, cash and food vouchers. Do you think this will help alleviate what was an already desperate situation before the upheaval? And we know that at the center of that was a lack of trust because of allegations and acts of corruption, which, was an impetus for a loss of faith in a government that already existed. People were already starving. We're told that it was easy to light the tinder for food rights because of this situation.
So I think that, every sort of intervention by government, in this case, supporting people with food parcels or cash grants, obviously they are helpful. It alleviates a very distressing situation throughout the country. But, what we saw over the last few weeks is the weaponization of a complex range of factors, which is not just related to the immediate sort of extreme situation in which poor people find themselves. I mean, our country is chronically poor, underdeveloped. We have large percentage of young people that simply cannot find jobs. So these short-term interventions, on the one hand, they obviously are helpful and necessary. On the other, we have, and now that we have fundamentally characterized this phenomenon as a sort of anti-constitutional insurrectionary project, one has to look at what the fundamentals are that underpin, the ability of these people to weaponize the citizenry against the state. It's not just the fact that over the last year and a half, there's been this imposition of restrictions and basically sort of that's had a devastating impact. It is that the poverty is chronic. And, the developmental path that we've chosen has not lifted poor black South Africans out of poverty. So to sort of simplistically characterize the thing as there are some people exploiting other people is not going to lead us to the kind of solutions that we need. We need to be very comprehensive in our approach. Anyone who thinks that arresting 12 people is going to put a stop to this is naive. We need to ask the question: why would people who fought for the liberation of this country be weaponized against their own state? And that has not too much to do with just the short-term crisis that we find ourselves in. So it has to do with, as you mentioned, people have lost confidence in the state because the state is not, we are not developing the society. We've lost confidence, people in general, in the ruling party because they see a party in which they've invested their future and their confidence literally breaking apart in front of their eyes. And so the question is, what do we do? What holds the country together? We have an ANC at each other's throats. So I think that it's very important that at this moment, when we are facing a sort of existential crisis, that we don't react in the ways that comes too easily to us. To say, let us arrest 12 people, we find them on social media. I mean, to reference, just go back to what Guy was. This in itself is not easy. I mean, we see the sort of perennial low-intensity warfare on the Cape Flats, for example, that the police has just been completely unable to manage. Now you have a highly organized insurrectionary project. And if we think that, in a matter of weeks or days, we are going to put that down, it's wishful thinking. So we need to be very comprehensive. Look at the economy, look at developing the security and intelligence structures, capability, and so on.
So, Ongama, let me continue then with that. The developmental agenda, which is what the ANC has anchored many of its policies and pronouncements on. What political action is then necessary? We've heard of people calling for a cabinet reshuffle in order to imbue a sense of trust in the powers that be. But we've also seen that there are competing priorities in managing this crisis, that of, giving a sense of hope. But surely there needs to be an injection of realism, of saying to the people of South Africa, the president didn't hit at the fact that the inequality and joblessness that we're seeing, the poverty is unsustainable. But is it enough? What is the political action that is required to re-energize South Africans, to make them believe that this is a government they can trust?
Sure. So I think this is multifaceted. And I think that we must be patient enough as South Africans to give this period to some time, especially the transformation of the political environment. I feel very strongly that what we are seeing in the ANC in general, even before this particular crisis, is a long-term sort of 10-year transformation process, which will culminate into something new. And I think that we will be in varying degrees of it in this period. The reason why I am resorting to answering you in that way, Tsepiso, is simply this. The momentum of self-destruction in the ANC has reached a threshold beyond which it cannot be pulled back. That's for sure. Why am I saying so? One, the warring factions in the party do not allow for certain things to be done, such as, for example, cabinet reshuffles. Part of the insecurity that President Cyril Ramaphosa is facing currently is that we are approaching an elective conference next year, and he must act against people who are power brokers. And in the ANC, because it doesn't follow that system of, for example, primaries where people must campaign freely among the rank and file membership of the party in order for them, to be elected and secure their term. You've got a strong emphasis on gatekeepers. Now, acting against people who are in cabinet is acting against gatekeepers, and power bases are important. So that's why I feel that we are going to see, if it's not a security situation, it's going to be a political instability, contestation for the succession of President Cyril Ramaphosa or his second term. So we are in a perpetual, in my view, 10-year period in which our only reliance is going to be the ability to enforce contracts and the constitutional order of the Republic, which is why I'm extremely opposed to suggestions that we must consider political solutions for the current impasse. Because as the political system caves in, as the ANC caves in as a party, we're going to need to rely on that rule of law as our only hope. Because in my view, what's happening in the party is inevitable.
So, Guy, let's look at what tactile solutions will bring about a sense of ease. First of all, we know President Cyril Ramaphosa has authorized the deployment of 25,000 members of the SANDF to support work of the police. Of these, 10,000 are now on the ground. We've also heard the argument that there should have been a lot more. Even the defense minister had said, even 75,000 would be preferable. But I'm looking at from the prism from which those, especially within the socio-economic classes in South Africa that feel that this would be enough. There are those who have said throughout this violence that we've seen in the country, it's the middle classes that was far more fearful of how out of hand the situation will get. So talk to me about how the law enforcement work out who to deploy in which areas and how to do it and the amount of force that is required and how that goes along according to the socio-economic strata that exist in South Africa.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer now because obviously the scenario is quite different because how things work up until now is that the police have a theoretical resource deployment model, and it depends on crime rates, it depends on a range of other factors, and they will allocate police personnel to specific stations based on this model that they use. Unfortunately, in the past, it's because of a lot of noise that is made and lobbying that's made by sort of middle-class South Africans, more police resources per capita tend to be allocated to middle-class and wealthier areas than they are to poorer areas, and of course that is along racial lines as well. And so I think that we need to go back to the drawing board on that and sort of think about, well, what happened in these two provinces, for example, but not only to focus on those two provinces, the other areas. David referenced the Cape Flats, for example, which is, similar forms of it's not insurrection, but it's similar forms of violence that's happening there. It's not necessarily against the state, but it certainly weakens the state. But I think it comes back to two things. So following on from what Ongama was saying is, number one, I think things need to be done in these areas which were the hotspots, which were the centers of violence, where we saw the most looting happening, where we saw the most unrest happening. And it's about, number one, thinking about what's the most appropriate law enforcement response for those areas. It's about building relations and building confidence. And one of the things, coming back, connecting to your question, Tapiso, and what Ongama was saying is local government is really what we need to be focusing on if we want to repair relations and build trust between citizens and the state again, because that's where most South Africans experience the state. It's at the local government level. And we know from what the Auditor General has said about the state of local government, also what the President has recently said, is that there's in a dire state of crisis. And there's, legacies of corruption and incompetence, and it has to do with cadre deployment, and it has to do with lack of experience and a lack of skills. And of these sort of things, if you're looking at areas, and this is, most kind of, you see it in many cases where there are uprisings and unrest, the states usually respond to say, what are the drivers of the unrest and violence in these particular places, and let's look to address them. But we shouldn't, focus all our resources there. I mean, the sort of points that David and Ongama have also made. I mean, there's this underlying poverty and desperation and inequality that kind of creates the ground for it to be weaponized. So I think it's important to focus on the areas, but you need a medium to longer term strategy to deal with this in the rest of South Africa as well.
Thank you to all of you for taking the time to speak to us and sharing your insights on the current situation. Dr. Guy Lam, whom you've just heard there, is from Political Science Department at the University of Stellenbosch. Political Analyst Ongama Mtimka, thank you very much to you as well. And to you too, David Africa of the Africa Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis.